Welcome to another one of my Sadler stories. You can tell I have a little companion here. This is Sassy, also known as Sassy Pants, also known as Minou, also known as a number of other things as well. And she is a 17 going on 18-year-old cat who I've known now for over 10 years. And she was one of two kittens that was fostered as rescues by my wife. They were survivors of a fire in New York. She's not big on being on camera. Somehow she always knows that's the case. So I'm going to let her down in just a sec. But first I thought I would have her here for just a minute. And she and I, as I tell her sometimes when we're going over our story together, became friends first, meaning that of all the animals that my wife had, Sassy was the one who I first held and talked to and petted and picked up. And the story goes sort of like this. So I'll tell the story of how my wife and I got together in much greater detail at some other point. But suffice it to say, we knew each other from high school and had crossed paths in the 1990s, and then later on reconnected and fell in love, and eventually decided, since I was living in North Carolina and she was living in New York, that I would leave my position at Fayetteville State University and move up there. Prior to that, we were doing the commuter couple thing, which meant that I would drive from Fayetteville, North Carolina, all the way up to the Hudson Valley in New York, which under good conditions would be about a 14-hour drive with a few stops, mostly up 95, and took quite a while, but towards the end of the trip, you'd start getting a little bit punch drunk, and a little reaction slowed. So the first time that I came up, I drove up and we met together, and the next day we went to my wife's apartment. Later on would be our apartment. It was what was euphemistically called a carriage house apartment, which basically means an apartment above a garage. So quite small. As a matter of fact, I'll tell a story about that sometime, or maybe I'll get her on and we'll talk about it together, because cramped conditions. And in that apartment, she had the two dogs that she'd also rescued and these two cats. And by that time, Sassy and Teensy, her sister, were no longer kittens. They were full adult cats. They each had their own personality. Teensy was actually a little bit bigger than Sassy. Sassy had a rough time of it at the start, tail that went necrotic. My wife had to give her antibiotics for years, and there was not a good prognosis for her, but they both had strong spirit and made it through. And so when my wife wanted to introduce me to the dogs gradually, but the cats were in the apartment when we went up the stairs and went in. And Teensy was always rather timid. It took her a while to get used to people. And, I think she may have peeked her head out once, and that was about it. But Sassy came trotting out. And, I said to her, "Wow, wow," and she came right over, and I picked her up and held her in my arms, and she started purring, and we became friends at that point. And, Teensy came around eventually. She unfortunately didn't live as long as Sassy. She's been gone about 6 years. Some organ failures, which sometimes happens in cats. And she and Sassy would, lay together and play together. You may have seen some of the pictures in social media, or when I posted some of the things about the cats and the dogs. They all were one big pack, which didn't mean that they always got along, but they certainly stuck up for each other and looked out for each other, and they would cuddle up quite often as well. And they did so with me. Some of you may have seen pictures of the cats helping me read, helping very euphemistically, since often they would pull the pages down or lay on top of my books. Those of you who have cats know how prone they are to doing that. Apparently they used to play on my wife's keyboard quite a bit as well, and I think at one point sent an email message by mistake. Sassy has now come back in the room. She's over in her beds and getting hunkered down. So Sassy and I have been through a lot together, and I thought I would, talk about her story and the time that we've spent together and some of the things that have happened and some of the things that we did, and that it would be kind of enjoyable for all of you. So one of the things that I'll tell you about that we did in Kingston when we lived in New York in the Hudson Valley was she would get to go outside. And actually I would let both the cats outside, but Teensy didn't want to spend any time outside, so that wasn't much of an issue. And Sassy was originally kind of nervous about it. We had a fenced-in yard, although the fence actually went into the woods, and part of it was not, a very rigid fence. It was a wire fence, and she could get on both sides of it. So I began by taking her downstairs. I would work outside quite often, reading or working on my computer, and I would carry her down with me, and she'd struggle a little bit, and then we'd go out, and I'd put her next to me by the table, and then she'd slink away trying to get to the staircase and then run right up the stairs and go back inside. If the door was closed, obviously she'd paw at it and make some, she didn't really make a lot of sounds, but sometimes she would make sounds in that case. As a matter of fact, she's only become a very vocal cat in the last few years. And so gradually she became used to being outside. I think it helped that she saw the dogs who, she was good friends with, hanging out outside. And she would, come down. I would leave the door open sometimes, and she would poke her head out, and then she would come down to see what I was doing. She'd wander over by the dogs. Eventually she went around the whole yard. And that's when she started to get herself in a little bit of trouble. Sometimes, once she realized that she could go outside, she really enjoyed it. And sometimes she would sneak outside. And I would sometimes come home from work and find her crying because she had gone up the hill and had managed to get on the other side of the fence and then couldn't figure out how to get herself back in and get herself back to her home. So she'd cry for me, and then I would have to climb up the hill, and as best as I could. Some of it was, falling, the dirt would fall down and all that. And then I'd put her on my back, and she'd sink her claws in, and then I would climb back down and take her around the yard, and we'd come back up, and she'd be secure now for a little while. And we did this a number of times. I don't think she ever really figured out how to get from one side of the fence. It was easy to get out of the fence. She could never figure out how to get herself back in. Or maybe she did, and I just never realized it because she didn't panic at that point anymore. So that was, a good part of what we did. And of course we did a lot of snuggling up and playing. She was a very playful cat, as was her sister. She loves catnip. Now in her late adult life, she gets catnip whenever she wants to, and I also go and pick wild catnip on my walks. So she's kind of in catnip heaven. She'll actually cry for it in the morning if she doesn't get it. One of the other big things that happened with her was we took a cross-country trip together, and it's not the first time that she'd ever been in a car. Obviously, she had to go to the vet, and she and her sister and the dogs took cross-country trips out here to Wisconsin with my wife previously as well. But this was when we were moving, and we were packed everything up into a giant U-Haul, much bigger truck than we actually needed, a truck that eventually broke down in the middle of Pennsylvania after going quite slow for quite a while. And so she was in this wire cage. My wife drove one of our Subarus. We'd had the other one already out in Wisconsin, loaded up, had the dogs in there, and I had the big truck, and Sassy in the cage next to me. And she was not super happy about being in a cage to begin with. She had food and drink and some catnip and lots of nice things to lay down on. But she cried for a good way, the sort of meow kind of meowing that shows that they're in a bit of distress. They're not super happy about what's going on. But after a while, she calmed down, and she'd look out the window, and we'd drive along, and And so, things went pretty good until the truck started having problems. The DEF fluid, that was the issue with that. I've done another video about that trip that you can watch if you want to. And we eventually had to get towed. The truck broke down. We had to put Sassy along with me in the cab of the semi-tow truck and ride another hour and a half to, I think it was Youngstown. It was our halfway point. And then in the middle of the night, load one truck into another truck to replace it. And then the next day, there goes Sassy back in the cage, back with me, driving in a smaller truck now to here in Wisconsin, where then Andy's parents met us, and we stayed in a hotel. And Sassy got to explore the hotel room and all that, while the dogs did as well. And it was nice to be back in Wisconsin again, where my wife and I are both from. Obviously, the dogs and cats were not from Wisconsin. But this became their new home, and then we got to move into this much larger apartment with lots of places for Sassy to explore. At that time, the dogs were still able to go up and down the stairs, and so it was nice to have the extra space. And that was more or less the end of Sassy's outside escapades until fairly recently, when we thought we had taken her to the vet, and she was having some issues with a bit of too much weight loss. She's got her weight back on now, fortunately, and so we went to the vet for one of the checkups, and then we thought about, well, should we go and see Andy's mom, and so we did, and then we were like, well, maybe Sassy could go outside, and so we let her outside in the yard, and as usual, she was kind of scared at first, kind of nervous. She actually wanted to head under the car, and I knew she was going to do that, so I headed her off. And then she realized, holy crap, I'm outside. I can do all this stuff. There's all these smells, all these sights, all this stuff that I don't get exposed to normally. And then it was game on, and she really enjoyed herself. I even took her in a more recent trip over to the wood pile where there's like some logs that were cut a while back, and she gets on top of them and starts scratching and asserting herself. She even spent some time just like laying down in the yard watching things going on, so she enjoyed that quite a bit. And for a 17-year-old cat, she is in pretty good shape, especially for a 17-year-old cat who had some serious health problems early on in her life. She goes up and down the stairs when she wants to. She hops up on things. She eats pretty well, and we do have her on some medications that help her out with her arthritis and things. But imagine in cat years, she's basically the equivalent of an 80 or 90-year-old woman. So she's doing a pretty good job, and she's really quite, I've had a lot of cats in my life, and, Sassy is the one who I still have left. We have a very close relationship. She likes to sleep next to me a lot of the time, and then, of course, when she's had enough of that, she gets up and comes back down here. And, the day is kind of punctuated, particularly in these COVID times where none of us are going anywhere. I think she really enjoys having people around nonstop. The only time I'm out of here is to, maybe do an errand or to take a walk. And so she's used to us having a constant presence in the apartment and being able to come out and talk to us if she wants to, and get up in our lap occasionally, or lay down in front of us. We have some toys for her, as usual. Of course, the cat toys that people buy, she's totally uninterested in, but there's quite a few other things. One of the things that we did is we bought a big thing of paper towels from Costco on these giant sort of like industrial size rolls. Turns out those rolls are one of the best toy for her. She loves it. They come apart a little bit, so they look like a spring made out of cardboard. And she'll knock them over if we set them up, and rub herself on them and squeeze her face into it. there's a few other things that she really enjoys. The rings off of certain bottled water drinks, you roll those on the floor, and she goes crazy chasing them. Obviously string, and catnip. Catnip is in the mint family, so you get these long, squarish stems after she's pulled all the leaves off, and she really enjoys that. She even, still enjoys doing a little bit of fetch. I didn't get to see this, but when she was younger, she had a hacky sack that you could throw, and she'd bring it back to you and fetch it. So she still does a little bit of that with the ring. She'll bring it to you and spit it out because she wants you to play with her. But she's an old cat, so she doesn't do that for an awful lot. She spends a lot of time sleeping, which is great. She does enjoy hanging out and cuddling, and so she's the last of our animals who is left. The end of our four-legged family, our pack, and we're happy that we still have her. Maybe we'll get to enjoy her for several more years, and we're cherishing the time that we have with her. So I thought I would do a little bit telling you stories about Sassy and some of the things we've done together and some of the time we've spent together.